Strange rumblings in Aztlan. The murder of Ruben Salazar. April 29, 1971. Whittier Boulevard has not been a peaceful street of late. And in truth, it was never peaceful. Whittier is to the vast Chicano Barrio in East Los Angeles what the Sunset Strip is to Hollywood. This is where the street action lives. The bars, the hustlers, the drug market, the whores, and also the riots, the trashings, killings, gassings, the sporadic bloody clashes with the hated common enemy, the cops, the pigs, the man. That blue-crusted army of fearsome gabacho troops from the East LA Sheriff's Department. The Hotel Ashman is a good place to stay if you want to get next to whatever's happening on Whittier Boulevard. The window of number 267 is about 15 feet above the sidewalk and just a few blocks west of the Silver Dollar Cafe, a nondescript tavern that is not much different from any of the others nearby. There is a pool table in the rear, a pitcher of beer sells for $1, and the faded Chicano barmaid rolls dice with the patrons to keep the jukebox going. Low number pays, and nobody seems to care who selects the music. We had been in there earlier when not much was happening. It was my first visit in 6 months, since early September when the place was still rancid with the stench of CS gas and fresh varnish. But now, 6 months later, the Silver Dollar had aired out nicely. No blood on the floor, no ominous holes in the ceiling. The only reminder of my other visit was a thing hanging over the cash register that we all noticed immediately. It was a black gas mask, staring blindly out at the room. And behind the gas mask was a stark, hand-printed sign that said, "In memory of August 29, 1970. Nothing else. No explanation. But no explanation was necessary, at least not to anybody likely to be found drinking in the Silver Dollar. The customers are locals, Chicanos and Barrio people, and every one of them is acutely aware of what happened in the Silver Dollar on August 29, 1970. That was the day that Ruben, the prominent Mexican-American columnist for the Los Angeles Times and news director for bilingual KMEX TV, walked into the place and sat down on a stool near the doorway to order a beer he would never drink. Because just about the time the barmaid was sliding his beer across the bar, a Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputy named Tom Wilson fired a tear gas bomb through the front door and blew half of Ruben Salazar's head off. All the other customers escaped out the back exit to the alley, but Salazar never emerged. He died on the floor in a cloud of CS gas, and when his body was finally carried out hours later, his name was already launched into martyrdom. Within 24 hours, the very mention of the name Ruben Salazar was enough to provoke tears and a fist-shaking tirade, not only along Whittier Boulevard, but all over East LA. Middle-aged housewives who had never thought of themselves as anything but lame status, quote, Mexican-Americans, unquote, just trying to get by in a mean gringo world they never made, suddenly found themselves shouting, "Viva la raza" in public. And their husbands, quiet Safeway clerks and lawn care salesmen, the lowest and most expendable cadres in the great gabacho economic machine, were volunteering to testify. Yes, to stand up in court or wherever and calling themselves Chicanos. The term Mexican-American fell massively out of favor with all but the old and conservative and the rich. It suddenly came to mean Uncle Tom, or, in the argot of East LA, Tio Taco. The difference between a Mexican-American and a Chicano was the difference between a Negro and a black. All this has happened very suddenly for most people. One of the basic laws of politics is that action moves away from the center. The middle of the road is only popular when nothing is happening. And nothing serious has been happening politically in LA for longer than most people can remember. Until 6 months ago, the whole place was a colorful tomb, a vast slum of noise and cheap labor, a rifle away from the heart of downtown Los Angeles. The Barrio, like Watts, is actually a part of the city core, while places like Hollywood and Santa Monica are separate entities. The Silver Dollar Cafe is a 10-minute drive from City Hall. The Sunset Strip is a 30-minute sprint from the Hollywood freeway. Whittier Boulevard is a hell of a long way from Hollywood, by any measure. There is no psychic connection at all. After a week in the bowels of East LA, I felt vaguely guilty about walking into the bar in the Beverly Hills Hotel and ordering a drink. as if I didn't quite belong there and the waiters knew it. I had been there before, under different circumstances, and felt totally comfortable. Or almost. There was no way to... Well, to hell with that. The point is that this time I felt different. I was oriented to a completely different world, 15 miles away. My first night in the Hotel Ashman was not restful. The others had left around 5. Then there was the junkie eruption at 7. Followed an hour later by a thundering, low-fidelity outburst of wailing norteño music from the jukebox in the Boulevard Cafe across the street. And then about 9:30, I was jerked up again by a series of loud whistles from the sidewalk right under my window, and a voice calling, "Hunter! Wake up, man! Let's get moving!" Holy Jesus, I thought. Only 3 people in the world knew where I am right now, and they're all asleep. Who else could have tracked me to this place? I bent the metal slats of the Venetian blind apart just enough to look down the street and see Rudy Sanchez, Oscar's quiet little bodyguard, looking up at my window and waving urgently. "Come on out, man. It's time. Oscar and Benny are up the street at the Sweetheart. That's the bar on the corner where you see all those people in front. We'll wait for you there, okay? You awake?" "Sure, I'm awake," I said. "I've been sitting here waiting for you, lazy criminal bastards. Why do Mexicans need so much fucking sleep?" Rudy smiled and turned away. "We'll be waiting for you, man. We're going to be drinking a hell of a lot of Bloody Marys, and you know the rule we have down here." "Never mind that," I muttered. "I need a shower." But my room had no shower. And somebody, that night, had managed to string a naked copper wire across the bathtub and plug it into a socket underneath the basin outside the bathroom door. For what reason? Demon rum, I had no idea. Here I was in the best room in the house, looking for the shower and finding only an electrified bathtub, and no place to righteously shave. In the best hotel on the Strip. Finally, I scrubbed my face with a hot towel and went across the street to the Sweetheart Lounge. Oscar Acosta, the Chicano lawyer, was there, leaning on the bar, talking idly with some of the patrons. Of the 4 people around him, all in their late 20s, 2 were ex-cons, 2 were part-time dynamite freaks and known firebombers, and 3 of the 4 were veteran acid eaters. Yet, none of this surfaced in the conversation. The talk was political, but only in terms of the courtroom. Oscar was dealing with 2 hyper-political trials at the same time. In one, the trial of the Biltmore 6, he was defending 6 young Chicanos who'd been arrested for trying to burn down the Biltmore Hotel one night about a year ago, while Governor Ronald Reagan was delivering a speech there in the ballroom. Their guilt or innocence was immaterial at this point, because the trial had developed into a spectacular attempt to overturn the entire grand jury selection system. In the preceding months, Acosta had subpoenaed every Superior Court judge in Los Angeles County and cross-examined all 109 of them at length, under oath, on the subject of their, quote, racism, unquote. It was a wretched affront to the whole court system, and Acosta was working overtime to make it as wretched as possible. Here were these 109 old men, these judges, compelled to take time out from whatever they were doing and go into another courtroom to take the stand and deny charges of racism from an attorney they all loathed. Oscar's contention throughout was that all grand juries are racist, since all grand jurors have to be recommended by Superior Court judges, who naturally tend to recommend people they know personally or professionally. And therefore, no rat bastard Chicano street crazy, for instance, could possibly be indicted by a, quote, jury of his peers, unquote. The implications of a victory in this case were so obvious, so clearly menacing to the court system, that interest in the verdict had filtered all the way down to places like the Boulevard, the Silver Dollar, and the Sweetheart. The level of political consciousness is not normally high in these places, especially on Saturday mornings. But Acosta's very presence, no matter where he goes or what he seems to be doing, is so grossly political that anybody who wants to talk to him has to figure out some way to deal on a meaningful political level. Acosta has been practicing law in the Barrio for 3 years. I met him a bit earlier than that, in another era, which hardly matters here, except that it might be a trifle less than fair to run this story all the way out to the end without saying at least once, for the record, that Oscar is an old friend and occasional antagonist, I first met him, as I recall, in a bar called the Daisy Duck in Aspen, when he lumbered up to me and started raving about ripping the system apart like a pile of cheap hay or something like that. And I remember thinking, well, here's another one of those fucked up, guilt-crazed dropout lawyers from San Francisco. Some dingbat who ate one too many tacos and decided he was really Emiliano Zapata. Which was okay, I felt. But it was a hard act to handle in Aspen in that high white summer of 1967. That was the era of Sgt. Pepper's, Surrealistic Pillow, and the original Buffalo Springfield. It was a good year for everybody. Or for most people anyway. There were exceptions, as always. Lyndon Johnson was one, and Oscar Acosta was another, for entirely different reasons. That was not a good summer to be either the President of the United States or an angry Mexican lawyer in Aspen. Oscar didn't hang around long. He washed dishes for a while, did a bit of construction work, bent the county judge out of shape a few times, then took off to Mexico to get serious. The next thing I heard, he was working for the public defender's office in L.A. That was sometime around Christmas of 1968, which was not a good year for anybody. Except Richard Nixon, and perhaps Oscar Acosta. Because by that time, Oscar was beginning to find his own track. He was America's only Chicano lawyer, he explained in a letter, and he liked it. His clients were all Chicanos, and most were political criminals, he said. And if they were guilty, it was only because they were doing what had to be done. That's fine, I said, but I couldn't really get into it. I was all for it, you understand, but only on the basis of a personal friendship. Most of my friends are into strange things I don't totally understand, and with a few shameful exceptions, I wish them all well. Who am I, after all, to tell some friend he shouldn't change his name to Oliver High, get rid of his family, and join a Satanism cult in Seattle? Or to argue with another friend who wants to buy a single-shot Remington Fireball so he can go out and shoot cops from a safe distance? Whatever's right, I say. Never fuck with a friend's head by accident. And if their private trips get out of control now and then, well, you do what has to be done. Which more or less explains how I suddenly found myself involved in the murder of Ruben Salazar. I was up in Portland, Oregon, at the time, trying to cover the National American Legion Convention and the Sky River Rock Festival at the same time, and I came back to my secret room in the Hilton one night to find an urgent message to call Mr. Acosta in Los Angeles. I wondered how he had managed to track me down in Portland, but I knew, somehow, what he was calling about. I had seen the LA Times that morning with the story of Salazar's death, and even at a distance of 2,000 miles, it gave off a powerful stench. The problem was not just a gimp or a hole in the story. The whole goddamn thing was wrong. It made no sense at all. Salazar case had a very special hook in it. Not that he was a Mexican or a Chicano, and not even Acosta's angry insistence that the cops had killed him in cold blood, and that nobody was going to do anything about it. These were all proper ingredients for an outrage, but from my own point of view, the most ominous aspect of Oscar's story was his charge that the police had deliberately gone out on the streets and killed a reporter who'd been giving them trouble. If this was true, it meant the ante was being upped drastically. When the cops declare open season on journalists, when they feel free to declare any scene of unlawful protest a free fire zone, that will be a very ugly day, and not just for journalists. Ruben Salazar was killed in the wake of a Watts-style riot that erupted when hundreds of cops attacked a peaceful rally in Laguna Park, where 5,000 or so liberal/student/activist type Chicanos had gathered to protest the drafting of Aztlan citizens to fight for the U.S. in Vietnam. The police suddenly appeared in Laguna Park with no warning and dispersed the crowd with a blanket of tear gas followed up by a Chicago-style mop-up with billy clubs. The crowd fled in panic and anger, inflaming hundreds of young spectators who ran the few blocks to Whittier Boulevard and began trashing every store in sight. Several buildings were burned to the ground. Damage was estimated at somewhere around $1 million. 3 people were killed, 60 injured. But the central incident of that August 29, 1970 rally was the killing of Ruben Salazar. And 6 months later, when the National Chicano Moratorium Committee felt it was time for another mass rally, They called it to carry on the spirit of Ruben Salazar. There's irony in this because Salazar was nobody's militant. He was a professional journalist with 10 years of experience on a variety of assignments for the neoliberal Los Angeles Times. He was a nationally known reporter, winning prizes for his work in places like Vietnam, Mexico City, and the Dominican Republic. Ruben Salazar was a veteran war correspondent, but he never shed blood under fire. He was good. He seemed to like the work. So he must have been slightly bored when the Times called him back from the war zones for a raise and a well-deserved rest covering local affairs. He focused on the huge Barrio just east of City Hall. This was a scene he had never really known despite his Mexican-American heritage, but he locked into it almost instantly. Within months, he had narrowed his work for the Times down to a once-a-week column for the newspaper and signed on as news director for KMEX-TV, the Mexican-American station, which he quickly transformed into an energetic, aggressively political voice for the whole Chicano community. His coverage of police activities made East Los Angeles Sheriff's Department so unhappy that they soon found themselves in a sort of running private argument with this man Salazar, this spick who refused to be reasonable. When Salazar got onto a routine story, like some worthless kid named Ramirez getting beaten to death in a jail fight, he was likely to come up with almost anything, including a series of hard-hitting news commentaries strongly suggesting that the victim had been beaten to death by the jailers. In summer of 1970, Ruben Salazar was warned 3 times by the cops to, quote, tone down his coverage, unquote. And each time, he told them to fuck off. This was not common knowledge in the community until after he was murdered. When he went out to cover the rally that August afternoon, he was still a Mexican-American journalist. But by the time his body was carried out of the Silver Dollar, he was a stone Chicano martyr. Salazar would have smiled at this irony, but he would not have seen much humor in the way the story of his death was handled by the cops and the politicians. Nor would he have been pleased to know that almost immediately after his death, his name would become a battle cry, prodding thousands of young Chicanos who had always disdained protest into an undeclared war with the hated gringo police. His paper, the LA Times, carried the account of its former foreign correspondent's death on its Monday front page. Mexican-American newsman Ruben Salazar was killed by a bullet-like tear gas shell fired by a sheriff's deputy into a bar during rioting Saturday in East Los Angeles. The details were hazy, but the new, hastily revised police version was clearly constructed to show that Salazar was the victim of a regrettable accident, which the cops were not aware of until many hours later. Sheriff's deputies had cornered an armed man in a bar, they said, and when he refused to come out even after loud warnings with a bullhorn to evacuate, the tear gas shells were fired and several persons ran out the back door. At that time, according to the sheriff's nervous mouthpiece, Lieutenant Norman Hamilton, a woman and 2 men, one carrying a 7.65 automatic pistol, were met by deputies who questioned them. I don't know whether the man with the gun was arrested on a weapons violation or not, Hamilton added. Ruben Salazar was not among those persons who ran out the back door. He was lying on the floor inside with a huge hole in his head. But the police didn't know this, Lieutenant Hamilton explained, because they didn't enter the bar until approximately 8 p.m. when rumors began circulating that Salazar was missing. And an unidentified man across the street from the bar told a deputy, "I think there's an injured man in there." At this point, said Hamilton, deputies knocked down the door and found the body. 2.5 hours later, at 10:40 p.m., the sheriff's office admitted that the body was Ruben Salazar. Hamilton could not explain, said the Times, why 2 accounts of the incident given to the Times by avowed eyewitnesses differed from the sheriff's account. For about 24 hours, Hamilton clung grimly to his original story, a composite, he said, of first-hand police accounts. According to this version, Ruben Salazar had been killed by errant gunfire during the height of a sweep of more than 7,000 people in Laguna Park, when police ordered everyone to disperse. Local TV and radio newscasts offered sporadic variations on this theme, citing reports still under investigation that Salazar had been shot accidentally by careless street snipers. It was tragic, of course, but tragedies like this are inevitable when crowds of innocent people allow themselves to be manipulated by a handful of violent, cop-hating anarchists. By late Sunday, however, the sheriff's story had collapsed completely in the face of sworn testimony from 4 men who were standing within 10 feet of Ruben Salazar when he died in the Silver Dollar Cafe at 4045 Whittier Boulevard, at least a mile from Laguna Park. But the real shocker came when these men testified that Salazar had been killed not by snipers or errant gunfire, by a cop with a deadly tear gas bazooka. Acosta had no trouble explaining the discrepancy. "They're lying," he said. "They murdered Salazar, and now they're trying to cover it up." The sheriff already panicked. All he can say is no comment. He's ordered every cop in the country to say nothing to anybody, especially the press. They've turned the East LA Sheriff Station into a fortress. Armed guards all around it, he laughed. "Shit, the place looks like a prison, but with the cops inside." Sheriff Peter J. Pitchess refused to talk to me when I called. The rude aftermath of the Salazar killing had apparently unhinged him completely. On Monday, he called off a scheduled press conference and instead issued a statement saying, "There are just too many conflicting stories, some from our own officers, as to what happened. The sheriff wants an opportunity to digest them before meeting with newsmen." Indeed, Sheriff Pitchess was not alone in his inability to digest the garbled swill that his office was doling out. The official version of the Salazar killing was so crude and illogical, even after revisions, that not even the sheriff seemed surprised when it began to fall apart, even before Chicano partisans had a chance to attack it. Which they would, of course. The sheriff had already got wind of what was coming. Many eyewitnesses, sworn statements, first-hand accounts. All of them hostile. The history of Chicano complaints against cops in East LA is not a happy one. "The cops never lose," Acosta told me, "and they won't lose this one either. They just murdered the only guy in the community they were really afraid of, and I guarantee you no cop will ever stand trial for it, not even for manslaughter." I could accept that, but it was difficult even for me to believe that the cops had killed him deliberately. I knew they were capable of it, but I was not quite ready to believe that they had actually done it, because once I believed that, I also had to accept the idea that they are prepared to kill anybody who seemed to be annoying them, even me. As for Acosta's charge of murder, I knew him well enough to understand how he could make that charge publicly. I also knew him well enough to be sure he wouldn't try to hang that kind of monstrous bullshit on me, so our phone talk naturally disturbed me, and I fell to brooding about it, hung on my own dark suspicions that Oscar had told me the truth. On the plane to LA, I tried to make some kind of a case, either pro or con, from my bundle of notes and news clips relating to Salazar's death. By that time, at least 6 reportedly reliable witnesses had made sworn statements that differed drastically, on several crucial points, with the original police version, which nobody believed anyway. There was something very disturbing about the sheriff's account of that accident. It wasn't even a good lie. Within hours after the Times hit the streets with the news that Ruben Salazar had in fact been killed by cops, rather than street snipers, the sheriff unleashed a furious assault on known dissidents who had flocked into East Los Angeles that weekend, he said, to provoke a disastrous riot in the Mexican-American community. He praised his deputies for the skillful zeal they displayed in restoring order to the area within 2.5 hours, thus averting a major holocaust of much greater proportions. Meanwhile, evidence was building up that Ruben Salazar had been murdered, either deliberately or for no reason at all. The most damaging anti-cop testimony thus far had come from Guillermo Restrepo, a 28-year-old reporter and newscaster for KMEX-TV, who was covering the riot with Salazar that afternoon, and who had gone with him into the Silver Dollar Cafe to take a leak and drink a quick beer before we went back to the station to put the story together. Restrepo's testimony was solid enough on its own to cast a filthy shadow on the original police version, but when he produced 2 more eyewitnesses who told exactly the same story, the sheriff abandoned all hope and sent his scriptwriters back to the sty. Guillermo Restrepo is well known in East LA, a familiar figure to every Chicano who owns a TV set. Restrepo is the out-front public face of KMEX News. And Ruben Salazar, until August 29, 1970, was the man behind the news, the editor. They worked well together, and on that Saturday, when the Chicano peace rally turned into a Watts-style street riot, both Salazar and Restrepo decided that it might be wise if Restrepo, a native Colombian, brought two of his friends, also Colombians, to help out as spotters and de facto bodyguards. Their names were Gustavo Garcia, age 30, and Hector Fabio Franco, also 30. Both men appear in a photograph taken seconds before Salazar was killed of a sheriff's deputy pointing a shotgun at the front door of the Silver Dollar Cafe. Garcia is the man right in front of the gun. When the picture was taken, he had just asked the cop what was going on, and the cop had just told him to get back inside the bar if he didn't want to be shot. The sheriff's office was not aware of this photo until 3 days after it was taken, along with a dozen others, by two more eyewitnesses who also happened to be editors of La Raza, a militant Chicano newspaper that calls itself the voice of the East LA Barrio. The photographs were taken by Raul Ruiz, a 28-year-old teacher of Latin American studies at San Fernando Valley State College. Ruiz was on assignment for La Raza that day when the rally turned into a street war with the police. He and Joe Razo, a 33-year-old law student with an MA in psychology, were following the action along Whittier Boulevard when they noticed a task force of sheriff's deputies preparing to assault the Silver Dollar Cafe. Their accounts of what happened there, along with Ruiz's photos, were published in La Raza 3 days after the sheriff's office said Salazar had been killed a mile away in Laguna Park by snipers and or errant gunfire. The La Raza spread was a bombshell. The photos weren't much individually, but together, along with the Ruiz-Razo testimony, they showed that the cops were still lying when they came up with their second, revised version of the Salazar killing. It also verified the Restrepo Garcia Franco testimony, which had already shot down the original police version by establishing beyond any doubt that Ruben Salazar had been killed by a deputy sheriff in the Silver Dollar Cafe. They were certain of that, but no more. They were puzzled, they said, when the cops appeared with guns and began threatening them, but they decided to leave anyway, by the back door, since the cops wouldn't let anybody out the front. And that was when the shooting started. Less than 30 seconds after Garcia was photographed in front of that shotgun barrel on the sidewalk. The weakness in the Restrepo Garcia Franco testimony was so obvious that not even the cops could miss it. They knew nothing beyond what had happened inside the Silver Dollar at the time of Salazar's death. There was no way they could have known what was happening outside or why the cops started shooting. The explanation came almost instantly from the sheriff's office, once again from Lieutenant Hamilton. The police had received an anonymous report, he said, that a man with a gun was inside the Silver Dollar Cafe. This was the extent of their probable cause, their reason for doing what they did. These actions, according to Hamilton, consisted of sending several deputies to deal with the problem. And they did so by stationing themselves in front of the Silver Dollar and issuing a loud warning with a bullhorn calling all those inside to come outside with their hands above their heads. There was no response, Hamilton said. So a deputy then fired 2 tear gas projectiles into the bar through the front door. At this point, 2 men and a woman fled out the back, and one of the men was relieved by waiting deputies of a 7.65 caliber pistol. He was not arrested, not even detained, and at that point, a deputy fired 2 more tear gas projectiles through the front door of the place. Again, there was no response, and after a 15-minute wait, one of the braver deputies crept up and skillfully slammed the front door without entering, Hamilton added. The only person who actually entered the bar, according to the police version, was the owner, Pete Hernandez, who showed up about a half an hour later after the shooting and asked if he could go inside and get his rifle. Why not, said the cops. So Hernandez went in the back door and got his rifle out of the rear storeroom, about 50 feet away from where Ruben Salazar's body lay in a fog of rancid CS gas. Then, for the next 2 hours, some 24 sheriff's deputies cordoned off the street in front of the Silver Dollar's front door. This naturally attracted a crowd of curious Chicanos, not all of them friendly. And one, an 18-year-old girl, was shot in the leg with the same kind of tear gas bazooka that had blown Ruben Salazar's head apart. The Salazar inquest rumbled on for 16 days, attracting large crowds and live TV coverage from start to finish. In a rare demonstration of nonprofit unity, all 7 local TV stations formed a combine of sorts, assigning the coverage on a rotating basis so that each day's proceedings appeared on a different channel. The LA Times coverage by Paul Houston and Dave Smith was so complete and often so rife with personal intensity that the collected Smith-Houston file reads like a finely detailed nonfiction novel. Read separately, the articles are merely good journalism, but as a document, arranged chronologically, the file is more than the sum of its parts. The main theme seems to emerge almost reluctantly, as both reporters are driven to the obvious conclusion that the sheriff, along with his deputies and all his official allies, have been lying all along. This is never actually stated, but the evidence is overwhelming. A coroner's inquest is not a trial. Its purpose is to determine the circumstances surrounding a person's death, not who might have killed him or why. If the circumstances indicate foul play, the next step is up to the DA. In California, a coroner's jury can reach only 2 possible verdicts: that the death was accidental or that it was at the hands of another. And in the Salazar case, the sheriff and his allies needed a verdict of accidental. Anything else would leave the case open, not only to the possibility of a murder or manslaughter trial for the deputy Tom Wilson, who finally admitted firing the death weapon, but also to the threat of a $1 million negligence lawsuit against the county by Salazar's widow. The verdict finally hinged on whether or not the jury could believe Wilson's testimony that he fired into the silver dollar at the ceiling in order to ricochet a tear gas shell into the rear of the bar and force the armed stranger inside to come out the front door. But somehow, Ruben Salazar had managed to get his head in the way of that carefully aimed shell. Wilson had never been able to figure out, he said, what went wrong. Nor could he figure out how Raul Ruiz had managed to doctor those photographs that made it look like he and at least one other deputy were aiming their weapons straight into the silver dollar, pointing them directly at people's heads. Ruiz had no trouble explaining it. His testimony at the inquest was no different than the story he had told me just a few days after the murder. And when the inquest was over, there was nothing in the 2,025 pages of testimony from 61 witnesses and 204 exhibits to cast any serious doubt on the Chicano eyewitness report that Ruiz had wrote for La Raza when the sheriff was still maintaining that Salazar had been killed by errant gunfire during the violence at Laguna Park. The inquest ended with a split verdict. Smith's lead paragraph in the October 6 Times reads like an obituary. Monday, the inquest into the death of newsman Ruben Salazar ended. The 16-day inquiry, by far the longest and costliest such affair in county history, concluded with a verdict that confuses many, satisfies few, and means little. The coroner's jury came up with 2 verdicts. Death was at the hands of another person, 4 jurors, and the death was by accident, 3 jurors. Thus, inquests might appear to be a waste of time. A week later, District Attorney Yvel Junger, a staunch law and order man, announced that he had reviewed the case and decided that no criminal charge is justified, despite the unsettling fact 2 of the 3 jurors who had voted for the death by accident verdict were now saying they had made a mistake. But by that time, nobody really gave a damn. The Chicano community had lost faith in the inquest about midway through the second day, and all the rest of the testimony only reinforced their anger at what most consider an evil whitewash. When the DA announced that no charges would be filed against Wilson, several of the more moderate Chicano spokesmen called for a federal investigation. The militants called for an uprising, and the cops said nothing at all. The night before I left town, I stopped by Acosta's place with Guillermo Restrepo. I had been there earlier, but the air was extremely heavy. As always, on stories like this, some of the troops were getting nervous about the stranger hanging around. I was standing in the kitchen, watching Frank put some tacos together and wondering when he was going to start waving the butcher knife in my face and yelling about the time I maced him on my porch in Colorado. That had been 6 months earlier, at the end of a very long night during which we had all consumed a large quantity of cactus products. And when he started waving a hatchet around, I figured mace was the only answer, which turned him to jelly for about 45 minutes. And when he finally came around, he said, "If I ever see you in East Los Angeles, man, you're going to wish you never heard the word mace, because I'm going to carve it all over your fucking body." So I was not entirely at ease watching Frank chop hamburger on a meat block in the middle of East LA. He hadn't mentioned the mace, not yet, but I knew we would get to it sooner or later. And I'm sure we would have, except that suddenly out in the living room, some geek was screaming, "What the hell is this goddamn gabacho pig rider doing here? Are we fucking crazy to be letting him hear all this shit? Jesus! He's heard enough to put every one of us away for 5 years!" Longer than that, I thought. At that point, I stopped worrying about Frank. A firestorm was brewing in the main room, between me and the door, so I decided it was about time to drift around the corner and meet Restrepo at the karaoke. Frank gave me a big smile as I left. "Losing Ruben was a goddamn disaster for the movement," Acosta said recently. "He wasn't really with us, but at least he was interested. Hell, the truth is I never really liked the guy. But he was the only journalist in LA with real influence who would come to a press conference in the Barrio. That's the truth. Hell, the only way we can get those bastards to listen to us is by renting a fancy hotel lounge over there in West Hollywood or some bullshit place like that, where they can feel comfortable and hold our press conference there, with free coffee and snacks for the press. But even then, about half the shitheads won't come unless we serve free booze, too. Shit! Do you know what that costs?" This was the tone of our conversation that night when Guillermo and I went over to Oscar's pad for a beer and some talk about politics. The place was unnaturally quiet. No music, no grass, no badmouth Bato Loco types hunkered down on the pallets in the front room. It was the first time I had seen the place when it didn't look like a staging area for some kind of hellish confrontation that might erupt at any moment. But tonight, it was deadly quiet. The only interruption was a sudden pounding on the door and voices shouting, "Hey man, open up! I got some brothers with me." Rudy hurried to the door and peered out through the tiny eye window. Then he stepped back and shook his head emphatically. "It's some guys from the project," he told Oscar. "I know them, but they're all fucked up." "God damn it," Acosta muttered. "That's the last thing I need tonight. Get rid of them. Tell them I have to be in court tomorrow. Jesus! I have to get some sleep." Rudy and Frank went outside to deal with the brothers. Oscar and Guillermo went back to politics, while I listened, sensing a downhill drift on all fronts. Nothing was going right. He was expecting a decision on his grand jury challenge in the Biltmore 6 case. "We'll probably lose that one too," he said. "The bastards think they have us on the run now. They think we're demoralized, so they'll keep the pressure on, keep pushing." He shrugged. "And maybe they're right. Shit. I'm tired of arguing with them. How long do they expect me to keep coming down to their goddamn courthouse and begging for justice? I'm tired of that shit. We're all tired." He shook his head slowly, then ripped the pop top of a Budweiser that Rudy had brought in from the kitchen. "This legal bullshit ain't making it," he went on. "The way it looks now, I think we're just about finished with that game. You know, with the noon recess today, I had to keep a bunch of these goddamn Batos Locos from stomping the DA. Christ, that would fuck me for good. They'll send me to the goddamn pen for hiring thugs to assault the prosecutor." He shook his head again. "Frankly, I think the whole thing is out of control. God only knows where it's heading, but I know it's going to be heavy. I think maybe the real shit is about to come down." Later that week, the Los Angeles Board of Supervisors voted to use public funds to pay all legal expenses for several policemen recently indicted for accidentally killing 2 Mexican nationalists, a case known in East LA as the murder of the Sanchez brothers. It was a case of mistaken identity, the cops explained. They had somehow been given the wrong address of an apartment where they thought 2 Mexican fugitives were holed up. So they hammered on the door and shouted a warning to, "Come out of there with your hands over your head or we'll come in shooting." Nobody came out, so the cops went in shooting to kill. But how could they have known that they'd attacked the wrong apartment? And how could they have known that neither one of the Sanchez brothers understood English? Even Mayor Sam Yorty and Police Chief Ed Davis admitted that the killings had been very unfortunate. But when the federal DA brought charges against the cops, both Yorty and Davis were publicly outraged. They both called press conferences and went on the air to denounce the indictments, in language that strangely echoed the American Legion outcry when Lieutenant Calley was charged with murdering women and children at My Lai. The Yorty-Davis tirades were so gross that a district court judge finally issued a gag order to keep them quiet until the case comes to trial. But they had already said enough to whip the whole Barrio into a rage at the idea that Chicano tax dollars might be used to defend some mad dog cops who frankly admitted killing 2 Mexican nationals. It sounded like a replay of the Salazar bullshit. Same style, same excuse, same result. But this time with different names and blood on a different floor. "They'll put me in jail if I won't pay taxes," said a young Chicano watching a soccer game at a local playground. "Then they take my tax money and use it to defend some killer pig. Hell, what if they had come to my address by mistake? I'd be as dead as hell right now." There was a lot of talk in the Barrio about drawing some pig blood for a change, if the supervisors actually voted to use tax funds to defend the accused cops. A few people actually called City Hall and mumbled anonymous threats in the name of the Chicano Liberation Front. But the supervisors hung tough. They voted on Thursday, and by noon, the news was out. The city would pick up the tab. At 5:15 on Thursday afternoon, the Los Angeles City Hall was rocked by a dynamite blast. A bomb had been planted in one of the downstairs restrooms. Nobody was hurt, and the damage was officially described as minor. About $5,000 worth, they said. Small potatoes compared to the bomb that blew a wall out of the district attorney's office last fall after Salazar died. When I called the sheriff's office to ask about the explosion, they said they couldn't talk about it. City Hall was out of their jurisdiction. But they were more than willing to talk when I asked if it was true that the bomb had been the work of the Chicano Liberation Front. "Where'd you hear that?" "From the city news service." "Yeah, it's true," he said. "Some woman called up and said it was done in memory of the Sanchez brothers by the Chicano Liberation Front. We've heard about those guys. What do you know about them?" "Nothing," I said. "That's why I called the sheriff. I thought your intelligence network might know something." "Sure they do," he said quickly. "But all that information is confidential." The preceding piece was originally published in Rolling Stone about a year after they published Hunter Thompson's own account of his attempted run for sheriff of Aspen, Colorado. That whole ordeal took a big toll on him, and it's interesting to look at where he went after that. This story led him to a deep, deep friendship with Oscar Acosta, which blossomed into their attempt to get away from Los Angeles and spend some real one-on-one time together talking about legal issues like this and race issues like this, especially in Los Angeles. That became Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas because, Hunter Thompson couldn't just write a story. He had to convince someone to give him a bunch of money to cover a motorcycle race in Las Vegas while then parlaying that opportunity into an attempt to gate crash a national convention of police officers specifically focused on drug enforcement. And it sort of puts things into an interesting context when you think about scenes in the book and the movie Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas where Hunter and his companion, sometimes referred to as his attorney or Dr. Gonzo, this character is a fictionalized version of Oscar Acosta. When they're both talking to a police officer from the American South or maybe the Midwest and explaining to this horrified career police officer that
drug-fueled satanic biker gangs have taken over Los Angeles. And to find out that, people actually believed them when they told these stories, it must have been hilarious because they're dealing in real life with serious racial tension and violence, corruption in the LAPD. And that, of course, makes everything these cops are talking about at a national convention in Las Vegas into a complete joke by comparison. They can't even figure out what hippies are or what a roach is or how many marijuanas go into a whole syringe of heroin or whatever the hell. Meanwhile, they're really living it. They're living what's going on in LA in a very, very brutal, violent, dirty, hateful scene fueled by a lot of racial prejudice and tensions, people just being fucking sick of the state of things. In one of the most populous cities in the country, if not the world, and in the midst of cultural revolution, or rather in the deep throes of the hangover of cultural revolution. And guys like Hunter and Oscar, through their experiences, I'm sure, had no fear of these cops from around the country that were clueless as to what was going on around them. A lot of these holdovers from World War II, perhaps, they were just looking to ride this out and retire. These are the guys that came home and couldn't figure out why their daughters were falling in love with Elvis Presley back in the 50s. And now some of them are grandparents. Compare that sort of life choice to some of the Hells Angels that Hunter S. Thompson wrote about in his book. A lot of those guys were ex-military. They could have been fighter pilots in World War II, and they couldn't adjust to life back home, so they became outlaws in a motorcycle gang. Hunter S. Thompson was a master at showing up in places where he didn't belong and had no right to be there, and infiltrating whatever scene he had to get the story done and inject himself into the story. That got a lot harder and basically impossible for him after he wrote Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail. Oscar was portrayed in film by Peter Boyle first in the movie Where the Buffalo Roam. Peter Boyle, of course, most famously was the monster in Young Frankenstein. This was opposite Bill Murray as Hunter S. Thompson. For the early 1980s, that seemed to make the most amount of sense, I'm sure. And then in the mid-90s, it was Benicio del Toro playing the part of Hunter S. Thompson's, or Raoul Duke's, lawyer, to greater effect, I think we could all say. And as far as the ethnicity, at least it was a little bit closer. Anyway, if you read the correspondence between Hunter S. Thompson and Oscar Acosta that was published in some of Hunter's books of letters in the 80s and 90s, you can read a very angry Oscar accusing him of ripping him off by collecting money for, books and the first movie portraying himself as a character, a fictional character, and not giving him any credit for being what he kind of saw as half the author of the experiences they went through. And an equally angry Hunter S. Thompson would write back an explanation that if he had used their real names, they would both be in prison. If you check out the Gonzo tapes that were released after Hunter S. Thompson's death, you can hear Oscar Acosta and Hunter on the road in Las Vegas with their tape recorder doing things like interrogating people at a taco truck and asking about the ingredients of the food that they're buying, things like that. But you can hear also the scenes from inside various hotel rooms, things like that, if you want to get a feel for what Oscar's real voice was like. Anyway, the important thing about reading something like this to me is that it puts Fear and Loathing and what came after it into a much more understandable context. And it does remind you that Hunter S. Thompson was a very serious-minded journalist with a lot of attitude before it got to the point where his own personal character was the centerpiece of every story he wrote. And of course, he was portrayed, I think, lovingly in cartoon form by the creators of the Venture Brothers, and maybe unlovingly in comic strip form by Gary Trudeau, creator of the strip Doonesbury, which I can't really analyze because I just can't read it. I tried to read it when I was young and when it was in the papers, and it's very boring. But apparently Gary Trudeau had some issue with Hunter Thompson, and he made him a cartoon character who did lots of illegal stuff. I don't know what his fucking problem is. I think there's some people that are just angry at him for not being liberal enough, maybe. And also, plenty of people like to use Hunter S. Thompson as sort of a way of calling out their goofy libertarian friends, or they like to say that reading his work is a phase you go through when you're in college, you know, much like The Doors. You're not supposed to listen to that once you get out of high school. I take exception with both of those attitudes, but maybe some of that's informed by the fact that I didn't read Hunter S. Thompson in my 20s or my teens like I guess you're supposed to. His use of language is always worth revisiting to me, like the slide guitar solos of Duane Allman. I don't see how that gets old. Now, on to the matter of Lieutenant Calley, who Hunter references towards the end of this piece. This comparison has a lot of depth that he doesn't really call out. There's a lot more going on here. There's a lot more similarities in these two cases than he sort of lets on. But maybe that's because the court-martial of Lieutenant Calley would have been fresh in everyone's mind at the time when they were reading this. We're talking about the My Lai massacre that took place in 1968. When you see in your mind images from various Vietnam movies that came out in the 80s and 90s and afterward of innocent women, children, and old men in a village in Vietnam somewhere being mercilessly gunned down by American soldiers for no good reason with no provocation, the case of Lieutenant Calley and Charlie Company is probably the first actual legal case and court-martial brought to the public's eyes and ears that represented something that would later become a recurring theme about the way soldiers behaved during the Vietnam War. Much like this case with the cops in East LA, the story of William Calley and Charlie Company massacring around 560 people in a village where there were no soldiers and only 3 weapons found started out with one blatant lie, and then when eyewitnesses contradicted that lie, a partial retelling of the story was brought out by the accused, and even that wasn't even close to what the truth actually was and eventually found to be. I'll read just a little bit from the account of the court-martial from famoustrials.com. That's famous-trials.com. It says, on February 23rd, 1971, William Calley took the stand. He told the jury he couldn't remember a single Army class on the Geneva Convention, but that he did know he could be court-martialed for refusing to obey an order. He testified that Medina had said the night before that there would be no civilians in My Lai, only the enemy. He said that while he was in the village, Medina had called and asked why he hadn't, quote, wasted the civilians yet. He admitted to firing into a ditch full of Vietnamese, but claimed that others were already firing into the ditch when he arrived. Calley said, I felt then, and still do, that I acted as directed. I carried out my orders, and I did not feel wrong in doing so. Ernest Medina and others flatly contradicted his story and said that he was the one that ordered men, even against their will, to mow down 560 or so innocent civilians, put them all in a ditch so they'd be easier to shoot all at once. Back to the text. After 13 days of deliberations, the longest in U.S. court-martial history, the jury returned its verdict, guilty of premeditated murder on all specifications. After hearing pleas on the issue of punishment, jury head Colonel Clifford Ford pronounced Calley's sentence: to be confined at hard labor for the length of your natural life, to be dismissed from the service, to forfeit all pay and allowances. Now, what actually ended up happening is this was reduced after opinion polls and public outcry to a 20-year sentence, then reduced to a 10-year sentence, and then reduced at the behest of President Richard Nixon to house arrest for about 3.5 years, after which he was set free. He still lives in Gainesville, Florida, as of May 2019, as far as the census is concerned. two things about this. Callie was not the only person guilty, but he was the only person sentenced. And this was so unbelievable because it was the first time a nightmare like this had been brought before the public's attention, and many more would come after. Sound familiar when it comes to the LAPD from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s? Yes, absolutely. At least in our American consciousness it is, and at least in the portrayal of things like that in movies and television. Hell, there's books, film, photographs documenting what happened in Nazi Germany, what happened to Dachau and Auschwitz. And there are still people that were born decades later that claim that it's so outrageous that it couldn't have actually happened. So, of course, lots of people didn't believe that our boys were going over there and committing atrocities like this themselves. Not when they hadn't had any sort of baseline for it. Not when they hadn't had any context or any reason to believe that sort of thing would be going down. Just like I'm sure plenty of law-abiding white people in Los Angeles wouldn't have believed that their police officers were corrupt. Anyway, we're now into my analysis, which you didn't come here for, so I hope you've bailed by now and moved on to something else. If you haven't, thanks for sticking around. I will try to do more like this for the 7 of you that need something this long to listen to. If you did, I assume you're asleep now, or perhaps just up all night, maybe on Adderall, looking for more things to shove into your brain. Maybe now go listen to the Pogues. The Boys from County Hell features lyrics like, "My father was a blue shirt, my mother a madame. My brother earned his medals at My Lai in Vietnam."
And with that, fair listener, I bid you adieu.